There still seems to be a ways for the Fed to cut rates again, and we would expect the odds to be greater than 50% that the Fed will cut rates at their upcoming FOMC meeting next week. And in fact, if we look at the most recent 20 years or so, it's quite clear that the goldish line, the tan line, which is the 2-year yield, has been leading the Fed policy rate, which is the blue line, which moves in step functions because they meet on a periodic basis, and they haven't very often done intermeeting changes to the Fed funds rate. So let's just start with back in 2004. It's quite obvious that the 2-year Treasury led the Fed policy on the way up in 2006 and 7. It's quite obvious that the 2-year Treasury led the Fed going into the global financial crisis. They kept rates virtually at zero for a number of years, almost 8 years, and you'll notice that the tan gold line, the 2-year Treasury yield, very obviously led the Fed higher going into the middle part of the tens. And then we see again, it led the Fed going into the rate decline from 2019, and again in 2021 we see that it led the Fed on the way up. We thought that the Fed was quite far behind the curve going into 2022, and indeed 2022 created the worst bear market in bonds of all time because the Fed was so far behind the curve. And now we see with this easing cycle, once again, the 2-year Treasury was very significantly leading the Fed. In fact, we got one of the biggest gaps ever between the 2-year Treasury yield and the Fed funds rate, which was hanging out at about 5 3/8 or so. And the 2-year Treasury was saying, wait a minute, guys, you're probably too tight by about 100 basis points. So the Fed has corrected about 75 basis points of that gap, but there still seems to be a ways for the Fed to cut rates again. And we would expect the odds to be greater than 50% that the Fed will cut rates at their upcoming FOMC meeting next week. So they'll get down more in line with the 2-year Treasury, which is what Fed Chair Jay Powell, I believe, means when he says that we're recalibrating the Fed funds rate. That's code word